Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two absolutely horrific disasters that are some of the most disturbing and frustrating ever covered on the channel. And although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the late 1980s, South Korea went through an incredibly transformative time. The world was watching as Seoul prepared to host the 1988 Summer Olympics, and the nation was determined to show off a sparkling new face. Concrete roads where rice paddies once stretched, cranes became as common as traffic lights, and everywhere you looked, something was being built. The country, which was rocketing out of post-war poverty and decades of dictatorship, had entered a full-blown development frenzy. Apartment complexes, highways, and high-rises sprang up almost overnight. And amid this flurry of growth, rules were often seen as suggestions and minor speed bumps on the road to economic prestige. Foreign construction firms were also banned from operating in Seoul, so domestic companies took the reins. And the result was fierce competition, overloaded project lists, and a business model that favored haste over caution. Bribes also flowed more freely than concrete, and inspectors looked the other way as buildings went up fast and sometimes too fast. In the trendy Gangnam district, long before it became synonymous with pop music, developers could see the monetary value. A chic upscale district that was rising not just economically, but symbolically. It was there that the Sampoong group broke ground on what would become their flagship achievement, the Sampoong department store. Construction began in 1987 on land that not so long ago had been a landfill, but that didn't matter to Lee Jun, the ambitious future chairman of Sampoong Group's construction division. He saw an opportunity where others saw red flags. The original blueprints for the site called for a modest 4-story residential apartment complex with multiple underground levels to be built by Woosung Construction. It was a straightforward plan that was both practical and safe, but safe didn't sell the dream, and Lee had bigger plans. Now, Lee wasn't a structural engineer, he wasn't even a builder by trade, but what he lacked in technical knowledge, he made up for in a stubborn ambition and a pathological disregard for rules. So once he seized control of the Sampoong Group's construction division, the original plans for the site were tossed in the trash. What replaced them was pure fantasy held together by wishful thinking, bribery, and shortcuts. The 4-story apartment block became a 5-story department store with 4 underground levels thrown in for good measure. Escalators were also added for flair, but that meant columns had to be cut away. Contractors at Woosung Construction raised alarms about the safety of these changes, and Lee responded by firing them on the spot and bringing in his own team. People who wouldn't argue when told to build something that defied the laws of physics and basic engineering. And in fact, even after the building was nearly complete, Lee wasn't done. He wanted more, so he added another floor that would house a skating rink, but even that quickly changed to a floor full of restaurants with kitchens. All of it would be placed on top of a structure that was never meant to carry that much weight. To maximize floor space, Lee also demanded that the diameter of the vertical support columns be reduced from 80 centimeters to 60. That doesn't sound like much, just a few inches on paper, but in terms of structural integrity, it was like replacing your car's tires with bicycle wheels and hoping for the best. The columns were also spaced farther apart than recommended, meaning each one had to shoulder more of the load. And worse yet, they were topped with flat slabs without beams or extra reinforcement to save money. And the overweight cherry on top of it all was air conditioning units. 3 of them in fact, giant cooling towers weighing a combined 87 tons once they were filled with water. These were initially installed on one side of the roof but sparked noise complaints from nearby residents. But instead of removing them properly with a crane, Lee Jun ordered his crew to simply drag them across the roof on rollers in 1993. Underneath this, the surface apparently cracked audibly. One of the columns they passed over, numbered 5E, was already weakened, and the added stress from the scraping and dragging began a slow, quiet death spiral for the building's internal support system. By 1995, the department store had been open for nearly 5 years. On the surface, it was still a roaring success, but that year the structure finally began showing signs of cracking. It began in April with hairline fissures forming on the 5th floor ceiling of the south wing. They were subtle but unmistakable, like spider veins crawling across the plaster. Shoppers didn't notice and most employees didn't either, but management did, and their response wasn't to call in structural engineers or evacuate the premises. Instead, Lee Jun's solution was far more on brand. He ordered the merchandise and some of the businesses on the top floor to be moved to the basement. In his eyes, this solved the problem, out of sight, out of mind, but for 2 months the cracks widened. Then came June 29, 1995, a sweltering, sticky summer Thursday in Seoul. That morning, the fissures in the ceiling multiplied and deepened. This time, everyone noticed, but still the door stayed open. Then that afternoon, the air conditioning units on the roof kicked on. The same units that had been dragged across the roof 2 years earlier, still sitting directly above the weakened column 5E, began to rumble. The vibrations then went through the slabs of the entire structure. Cracks then grown louder and plaster fell, and customers even began to complain about the noise and the trembling. By then, there was an unmistakable feeling that something was off. In response, in a rare moment of reluctant caution, management shut off the cooling towers and closed off parts of the 5th floor, but still, the idea of closing the store entirely was unthinkable. There were profits to be made, obviously. Behind closed doors, an emergency board meeting was held in the north wing. Engineers then conducted a hasty inspection that was just enough to know they were sitting on what was essentially a loaded gun. Some directors pleaded for an evacuation, but Lee's response was one of furious refusal. So, the south wing stayed open as its floors continued to groan under the weight the structure was never meant to carry. Around 5 p.m., the 5th floor ceiling began to visibly sag, floor tiles cracked, and the roof above the 4th floor started dipping. By then, it should have been obvious to everyone that the building was in serious trouble, and yet, no evacuation was ordered, and because of this, no one took things seriously. One employee even posed for a photo next to one of the widening cracks before joking that if you shook the wall hard enough, the building might come down. At just before 6 p.m., families continued to shuffle through the aisles, picking up groceries for dinner. Then, suddenly, a sharp cracking sound like a whip echoed throughout the building. Then another, and at 5:50 p.m., alarms finally blared. Staff shouted for people to get out, and shoppers dropped their bags and bolted for the exits, but it was already too late. Just 2 minutes later, at 5:52 p.m., the floor gave out, and this happened terrifyingly fast. In less than 20 seconds, the entire south wing of the 5-story department store folded into itself. Floor by floor, the slabs pancaked downward as the overloaded columns sheared apart in a horrifying chain reaction. Concrete roared, glass exploded, and steel twisted as the building collapsed into its own basement. And outside, there was equal chaos. Sirens screamed and people ran in all directions, covered in soot and blood and choking on debris. Some survivors wandered the streets dazed, their clothing shredded and their faces blank. Others clawed at the edge of the rubble, trying desperately to dig out loved ones with bare hands. And all the while, the north wing was untouched by the collapse. Inside, the executives who held the emergency meeting just hours earlier were safe, protected by geography and luck. Downstairs in the south wing's tomb, however, more than 1,500 people had been inside the building when it fell. Of those, 502 would not make it out alive. Many of the victims were store employees, 302 of them to be exact, doing nothing more than their jobs. The rest were mostly customers, many of them women doing their evening shopping. Children were also among the dead, and families were shattered. Survivors reported hearing screams from beneath the surface for a time, and then finally, silence. Rescue teams were on the scene within minutes, but the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. The wreckage was unstable, and fires had ignited from gasoline leaking out of crushed vehicles in the underground parking garage. Columns still groaned under the weight of debris, threatening to bring down whatever hadn't already collapsed. Despite this, though, rescuers still went in. First responders then began the agonizing task of lifting concrete piece by piece and listening for signs of life beneath the rubble. Simultaneously, to contain the fires, authorities made the difficult decision to spray the wreckage with water. It saved some, but for others, the flooding of the water sealed their fate. Trapped survivors who might have otherwise been pulled out alive drowned instead. And the pain didn't stop there. Onlookers gathered by the hundreds, watching as the rubble was combed for loved ones, and many refused to leave. Seoul's mayor also eventually announced plans to call off the rescue due to fears of further collapse, but the public erupted. Furious protests broke out, led by families of the missing who demanded the search continue. The mayor then backtracked and crews returned to the pile. A man pulled from the debris after 9 days reported that others had drowned, helpless, in the same pocket of air that kept him alive. Another survivor, an 18-year-old, was found nearly 12 days after the collapse, dehydrated but alive. He was thought to be the last person they would pull out alive, but on day 17, when all hope should have been gone, a 19-year-old department store clerk was found alive with nothing more than a few scratches. Her survival seemed almost supernatural. She had been sustained by rainwater and sheer force of will, but hers was the final rescue. The digging would continue, but only to recover the dead. In the aftermath, and as the site of the disaster was still being combed, an investigation got underway to determine exactly how this could have happened. Initially, the fires that smoldered in the rubble led to suspicion of a gas explosion, but the more engineers and investigators sifted through the debris, the more the real story started to emerge. In simplest terms, they determined that the Sampoong department store had been underbuilt. Columns were too narrow and spaced too far apart to support the weight of the structure. Things then went downhill fast when the air conditioners were dragged along the rooftop and placed directly over column 5E. Cracks appeared almost immediately, and the building manager saw them but did nothing. It was clear that this wasn't a mystery or just some accident, it was deliberate neglect from the top down. Once the truth was out, there was no saving face. During his interrogation, Lee apparently showed no remorse for the hundreds of lives lost. His main concern, he said, was the financial damage to his company. It was a statement that summed up the entire tragedy. So in December of 1995, Lee was found guilty of criminal negligence. Prosecutors initially sought a 20-year sentence, but in the end, the court handed him 10.5 years. On appeal, it was then reduced to 7.5. Lee would serve his time quietly, but died in 2003, just months after his release from a combination of diabetes, high blood pressure, and kidney failure. And the loss of life that day in 1995 still stands as the deadliest peacetime event in South Korea's history. Although accurate numbers are difficult to measure, as many as 2.8 million Cambodians may have been killed during the reign of the Khmer Rouge between the spring of 1975 and January of 1979. And as horrifying as that number is, to put that further into perspective, nearly 1/4 of the country's population starved or was killed in less than 4 years. This period will always be remembered as one of the worst chapters in human history, and even now it's painfully fresh in the minds of many survivors. But even so, the country was filled with hope and positivity 3 decades later in November of 2010 as millions of Cambodians descended on the capital city for the annual water festival. Cambodians celebrate this water festival, or Bon Om Duk, each year in late October or early November. The festival marks the end of the monsoon season that typically lasts between May and October, and it also coincides with the second time of the year that a local river actually reverses flow. The result is a 3-day celebration that's one of the biggest events of the year. Unfortunately, it was banned during the infamous Civil War and suspended for much of the subsequent power struggle that threw the country into additional turmoil in the 1990s. To the delight of war-weary citizens, though, it was officially reinstated in 1993 when the country was occupied by the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia. Relatively small celebrations have been held all over the country ever since, but the real action has always been in Phnom Penh, the country's capital. From dragon boat races and carnival rides to food stalls and concerts, the multi-day event draws thousands of foreign tourists and millions of Cambodians from far corners of the kingdom. It's seen as a time to relax, celebrate, and reconnect with friends and family members. By some estimates, the 2010 Water Festival attracted nearly 4 million visitors, and of that, more than half came from rural provinces because only about 1.3 million people lived in Phnom Penh at the time, and needless to say, the city was bursting at the seams. This was especially true along the popular riverside area between the Kro Chungva Bridge to the north and Ka Pik, or Diamond Island, to the south. Authorities always closed the roads and streets around the riverside to motorized traffic, but congestion was always a problem anyway because the number of visitors increased with each passing year. One area that was particularly prone to congestion was this crossover point between the south end of the riverside and Diamond Island. In previous years, there were only a few small footbridges, but by late 2010, 2 one-way bridges had been built across a relatively narrow portion of the river that served as the dividing line between Diamond Island and the southernmost portion of the riverside. Before the water festival, the North Bridge carried traffic from Diamond Island to Phnom Penh, while the identical bridge 600 feet to the south carried traffic in the opposite direction. But on Saturday, November 20th, the first day of the water festival, when authorities closed the bridge to motorized traffic, almost immediately they were inundated with pedestrians who understandably disregarded the directional signs that cars typically used. It just became a mass of free-flowing people across the whole bridge. But this wasn't really an issue, and the first few days of the festival went off without a hitch. On the evening of Monday, November 22nd, so the last day of the 3-day festival, tens of thousands of people descended on Diamond Island to eat, meet up with friends and family members, and attend a free concert. Simultaneously, many families with children were calling it a night after a long day of watching dragon boat races at the riverside. Of those, many were heading to hotels, guest houses, and the homes of family members they were staying with. By about 8:30 p.m., both bridges were so packed that moving in either direction became almost impossible. Then, before anyone knew what happened, thousands of pedestrians found themselves trapped in a no-man's land in the middle of the North Bridge. And all the while, many more people who were oblivious to this at either end were still moving in opposite directions, which meant that people in the middle were being squeezed in a giant vice. By about 8:30, both bridges were so packed that moving in either direction became almost impossible. The tropical heat and humidity were also stifling, even at that hour, but being in such close proximity to so many warm bodies made the situation exponentially worse. In fact, the heat and relentless pressure eventually got so bad that many people were struggling just to breathe. Meanwhile, others were coming to the terrifying realization that the situation was spiraling out of control, that they might actually suffocate or get crushed if it got any worse. Of course, this was particularly horrifying for parents with children. Then, at about 9:15 or 9:20, the bridge beneath the crowd's feet began trembling and swaying as if it were about to collapse under the strain. At that point, some of the strongest and most decisive pedestrians grabbed their loved ones' hands and began pushing their way through the crowd toward one end of the bridge or the other. In the chaos as well, a number of power poles and high-voltage electric lines were also toppled, so within a matter of minutes, dozens or possibly even hundreds of people got electrocuted and fell to the ground amidst the seething mass of people. Somewhere in the chaos at about the same time, a rumor began spreading that a group of violent young thieves was robbing the people stuck in the middle of the bridge. It's unclear if this claim was true or whether it was a byproduct of the growing hysteria, but whatever the case, outright panic spread through the crowd, and unsurprisingly, it kicked off what can only be described as an unstoppable stampede. In the middle of all this, 18-year-old Meng grabbed his brother Sven's hand and pulled him close to prevent him from getting trampled. By then, it was all they could do to breathe and stay together as forces acting on them intensified. As more and more people collapsed around them, Meng eventually lost his grip on his brother's hand and watched helplessly as he disappeared into the crowd. Moments later, Meng got pinned against the side of the Rainbow Bridge, and when he peered down to the water below him, he saw dozens of bodies floating in the river. Meanwhile, nearby, 20-year-old Tuk and his friend were trapped in similar positions. Tuk told his friend that he was dizzy and that he was about to pass out and that they'd both die if they didn't get off the bridge as soon as possible. And with that, they got onto their hands and knees and began crawling through the jostling legs and over mounds of trash and bodies as horrific shouts, groans, and gasps reverberated all around them. Unfortunately, Tuk quickly got separated from his friend, but somehow made it to the end of the bridge where he helped pull nearly 24 people to safety. Not everyone would be so lucky though. One terrified young woman looked at him and begged him to contact her family and tell them what happened before releasing her grip and passing just a few feet from the edge of the bridge. Sadly, Tuk wasn't able to grant her wish because he had no idea who she was or where she was from. The stampede on the Rainbow Bridge only lasted a few minutes, and police officers and soldiers began arriving shortly thereafter. In the early going, they focused on controlling the frantic crowd, getting the injured people off the bridge, and providing whatever first aid they could until the ambulances got there. That said though, getting the injured survivors out of the area wasn't easy because nearly all the roads in the area were still closed. And as word of the tragedy spread, some people actually began walking toward the site of the accident. Thankfully, this situation would stabilize within the hour, but the scene on the bridge was indescribably horrific. The road surface was strewn with bottles, food, shoes, clothes, hats, and hundreds of people contorted in disturbing positions. Tragically, while waiting impatiently behind a makeshift barricade, Meng finally saw his brother's body in one of the staging areas. Meanwhile, police officers and soldiers were busy pulling even more bodies from the river beneath the bridge. By late that night, the deceased had all been transported to a hospital and arranged on straw mats under a massive tent. Outside, distraught family members were impatiently waiting for their turn to see if their missing loved ones were among them. Once identified, the bodies were covered with a sheet and eventually taken to staging areas designated for victims from the same province or hometown. And although most of the deceased had been identified by the following morning, some never were. According to initial reports from doctors, many had died from suffocation and electrocution, and of those, many bore significant wounds from being trampled. In the early going, it also looked like the death toll might exceed 500. The numbers were eventually revised downward, and at least officially, 347 people lost their lives, with another 755 that sustained serious injuries. Of the deaths, many were villagers from remote provinces, and of those, many were young women. Authorities would eventually attribute this to two main factors. First, many of the victims didn't know how to swim, and so they were too scared to jump, even though the river was only about 50 feet or 15 meters down. Of the people who wound up in the river, it's thought that most were already unconscious when they fell or were inadvertently pushed from the bridge. And as for the disproportionately high number of young women who died that night, the sad fact was that they simply weren't strong enough to resist the weight of people pushing against them. Shortly after the tragedy, the government launched an investigation to determine why so many lives were lost. And after examining the evidence and interviewing hundreds of witnesses and survivors, investigators determined that the panic and subsequent stampede started when pedestrians felt the bridge swaying and assumed it was about to collapse. However, journalists with the Phnom Penh Post who was there that night claimed that police officers actually caused the fatal stampede by shooting the crowd with powerful water cannons in a last-ditch effort to get them to disperse. The government would deny this allegation, but eventually announced that each of the victims' families would receive 5 million riel, or about $1,300. Likewise, each of the injured survivors received 1 million riel, or about $260. A memorial was eventually built at the site of the tragedy, and to this day, many survivors and witnesses have never attended another water festival celebration. In fact, the experience was so traumatic that many won't even go to weddings, malls, busy markets, or anywhere else where large crowds of people congregate. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Also, in case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Also, in case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.